By the start of 1972, the city of Chicago felt a darkness creeping through its streets. Beneath the mask of a friendly clown, John Wayne Gacy was beginning a horrifying spree of murders that would terrorize the city for years. On the surface, John Wayne Gacy appeared to be the embodiment of the American dream. He lived in a quiet Chicago suburb, owned a successful construction business, and was known among neighbors as a man who worked hard and gave back to his community. He hosted block parties, attended local fundraisers, and was even active in Democratic politics. When people in his neighborhood thought of Gacy, they thought of the friendly man who always had a smile and a joke to share. But there was another mask he wore, one that would earn him an infamous title that chilled the nation: the Killer Clown. Gacy's clown persona, Pogo the Clown, was his most disarming disguise. On weekends and holidays, he would dress in a red and white suit, paint his face, and perform at children's parties, hospitals, and charity events. To families, Pogo was harmless entertainment, a playful symbol of joy who made kids laugh and parents feel at ease. The community applauded his willingness to volunteer his time, to give children a reason to smile. His clown makeup, with its bold lines and exaggerated features, became a familiar sight in Chicago's northwest suburbs. But beneath the grease paint and costume lay a man harboring unspeakable darkness. While he made balloon animals by day, at night Gacy prowled a far more sinister stage. The man who danced and laughed with children was the same man who would lure young boys and men into his home, never to be seen alive again. The contrast between his public and private selves was so severe, so unimaginable, that it would later horrify even seasoned detectives. This duality of civic volunteer and sadistic predator was what made Gacy's story so terrifying. Unlike the faceless monsters of urban legends, he wasn't an outsider lurking in shadows. He was one of them, a neighbor, a man whose handshake felt trustworthy. Parents invited him into their homes. Children sat on his lap while he wore the colorful face of Pogo. No one suspected that behind that painted smile was a man already plotting his next victim. The nickname the Killer Clown would eventually become shorthand for this unsettling truth: that evil can hide in plain sight. His case forced the public to confront a frightening reality: that predators don't always look like villains. They can disguise themselves as the helpful neighbor next door, the cheerful entertainer, or even a charitable community leader. When Gacy was finally unmasked, the nation struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the horrors uncovered beneath his home. His basement and crawl space, where the remains of dozens of victims were discovered, stood in chilling contrast to the cheerful face of Pogo. The image of the clown, once a symbol of innocence, was forever tainted. From then on, for many, clowns would no longer be figures of fun, but reminders of hidden darkness. In the years following his arrest, journalists and true crime experts often returned to that dual image: Gacy, the friendly clown, and Gacy the killer. The mask was not just painted on his face, it was woven into his life. Every act of kindness, every party appearance, every photograph of him dressed in costume was a layer of camouflage concealing his predatory hunger. The terrifying part wasn't just that he killed, it was how easily he fooled everyone around him. And so, the story of John Wayne Gacy begins not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, with a man whose smile appeared warm and genuine, whose presence seemed safe and familiar. He was a clown, yes, but not the kind meant only to amuse. He was a clown whose mask hid a predator, and whose crimes would forever etch his name into history as one of America's most infamous serial killers: the Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy's beginnings were not marked by the colorful mask of a clown, but by the struggles of a boy trying to find his place in the world. Born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, he grew up in a working-class household as the middle child of three. His parents, John Stanley and Marion Gacy, appeared like any other family raising children in the post-war years, but behind closed doors, life was far from ordinary. His father, a World War I veteran and auto mechanic, ruled the home with an iron fist. He was strict, quick-tempered, and often harsh with his only son. Young John longed for his father's approval, but instead of encouragement, he was met with criticism. His father often dismissed him as weak, labeling him in ways that cut deeply into his self-esteem. The harder John tried to impress him, the further away that approval seemed. Health problems added to his difficulties. From an early age, Gacy suffered from fainting spells and a heart condition that frequently sent him to doctors and hospitals. Physical activities other boys enjoyed were often out of reach for him. His father, however, did not see sickness. He saw weakness, and this fueled his disappointment even further. To John, every trip to the hospital felt less like healing and more like another reason for his father to lose respect for him. At school, things were no easier. His lack of athletic ability and frequent illnesses made him a target for teasing. Other children called him names and left him on the sidelines, watching rather than participating. The combination of rejection at home and bullying at school left him feeling isolated. In those years, he learned an early skill that would define much of his life: the ability to wear a mask. Outwardly, he smiled, behaved politely, and tried to appear like the dependable boy teachers could count on. Inwardly, he carried wounds no one could see. As Gacy grew older, cracks in his emotional foundation began to show. He wanted desperately to be accepted, particularly by male figures of authority, but felt constantly judged and dismissed. His inner world became a place of secrets, confusion, and unanswered questions. He struggled with feelings he did not fully understand, and rather than voice them, he pushed them down and locked them away. There were also moments of betrayal that deepened his mistrust. People he should have been able to rely on let him down, leaving him with experiences he carried in silence. Too afraid to speak up, and already conditioned to believe he would not be supported, John buried those memories. That silence, unbroken for years, became another layer of the mask he wore. By his teenage years, Gacy had become skilled at presenting the version of himself he thought others wanted to see. To teachers and neighbors, he was the polite young man willing to help. To his mother, he was the son who leaned on her for comfort. To his father, he remained a disappointment, no matter what he achieved. And to himself, he was someone caught between longing for acceptance and battling with shame. These early struggles did not create the man he would become, but they shaped the foundation of his personality. His childhood in Chicago was marked by discipline, illness, bullying, and secrets that stayed hidden for years. Behind the polite smile of a boy eager to please was the first shadow of a mask that would grow more convincing as he entered adulthood, and one that would one day conceal a darkness few could have imagined. As John Wayne Gacy entered adulthood, he appeared to be leaving behind the shadows of his troubled childhood. By his early 20s, he was working steadily, involved in politics, and even building a family of his own. To many who knew him, he seemed like a young man finally finding stability. Yet beneath that outward picture of success, troubling behaviors and darker impulses were beginning to surface, patterns that would soon bring his carefully built image crashing down. In the early 1960s, Gacy married Marlynn Myers, a woman whose father owned several Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Through this connection, Gacy secured a good job managing the businesses, and the couple moved to Iowa to start their new life. To the community there, Gacy appeared ambitious and hardworking. He was active in local organizations, even volunteering with the JCs, a civic group dedicated to leadership and community service. By day, he was a family man and businessman. By night, he enjoyed social gatherings where he made himself seem charismatic and likable. But as had been true throughout his life, appearances were deceiving. Behind closed doors, Gacy's darker side began to emerge. Though he was a husband and soon a father of 2 children, his private life revealed troubling behavior. He frequently hosted gatherings at his home where alcohol flowed freely. Among his guests were often young men and teenage boys, whom he would lure with promises of drinks, jobs, or simply the thrill of being included by an older, seemingly successful man. In 1968, Gacy's facade of respectability crumbled. He was accused of inappropriate conduct with a teenage boy who came forward to authorities. The case shook the local community, as few could reconcile the allegations with the man they thought they knew: the businessman, the volunteer, the husband and father. Still, the evidence mounted, and Gacy was convicted of the crime. For many, this conviction was the first glimpse at the hidden side of John Wayne Gacy. His carefully maintained public image fell apart, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison at the Anamosa State Penitentiary. His wife, devastated and unwilling to raise their children under the shadow of his crimes, filed for divorce. By the time the paperwork was finalized, Gacy had lost not only his freedom, but also the family life he had worked to build. Prison, however, did not silence Gacy's drive to appear respectable. Even behind bars, he cultivated the image of a model inmate. He participated in prison programs, earned the trust of guards, and even took on leadership roles within the institution. His ability to charm and manipulate, traits that had allowed him to hide his darker urges in the outside world, served him well inside prison walls. Inmates and staff alike described him as someone who worked hard and followed the rules. This behavior paid off. Though sentenced to 10 years, Gacy served only a fraction of that time. After just 18 months, he was granted parole for good behavior. In 1970, he walked out of prison a free man, his record forever marked, but his outward confidence intact. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life. Yet beneath the surface, nothing had truly changed. Prison had not addressed the inner darkness that drove him, nor had it diminished his ability to deceive those around him. If anything, it reinforced his belief that he could outsmart the system, that he could charm his way out of consequences. To neighbors and acquaintances, he would once again appear as a man striving for normalcy. But in reality, Gacy was already walking down a path that would lead to some of the most chilling crimes in American history. The first conviction in Iowa was only a glimpse of what he was capable of. It was an early warning sign, a signal of the predator behind the mask. Unfortunately, that warning was not enough to stop him. His release opened the door for him to continue the double life he had already begun. Respected citizen on the outside, dangerous manipulator behind closed doors. When John Wayne Gacy returned to Chicago after his release from prison in 1970, he seemed determined to rebuild his reputation and put his troubled past behind him. He moved back into his childhood neighborhood and worked tirelessly to craft the image of a respectable, hardworking man. To those around him, it appeared as though he had turned his life around. Soon after his return, Gacy remarried. His second wife, Carol Hoff, was a recently divorced mother of 2 daughters. The couple moved into a modest home on West Somerdale Avenue, a place that would later become infamous. For now, though, it looked like the foundation of a fresh start. Gacy played the role of stepfather and family man, hosting neighborhood barbecues and throwing parties that brought the community together. At the same time, he began running his own construction business, PDM Contractors. The company started small, specializing in remodeling and maintenance work. But Gacy threw himself into it with ambition. He often hired local teenagers and young men, presenting himself as a mentor who was giving them opportunities to earn money and learn a trade. To neighbors and clients, he was a man of energy and purpose, someone who was steadily building success from the ground up. Beyond his business, Gacy became active in civic life. He joined local organizations, took part in Democratic Party politics, and volunteered for community events. He worked on campaigns, hosted fundraisers, and gained the attention of local leaders who saw him as dependable and enthusiastic. His ability to network and his eagerness to be seen in a positive light helped him build a wide circle of acquaintances. But the part of his life that won him the most attention was his role as a clown. Gacy created 2 clown characters, Pogo and Patches, dressing in full costume and makeup for children's parties, hospital visits, and charitable events. He claimed the clown persona allowed him to return some joy to the community and bring smiles to children. Parents saw him as generous and good-natured, and kids laughed at his balloon animals and silly jokes. By the mid-1970s, Gacy's public image was firmly established. He was a businessman, a community volunteer, a political supporter, and a clown who entertained children. To outsiders, he looked like the very definition of a man who had reformed his life. What no one knew, however, was that this carefully constructed image was the ultimate mask, one that concealed the darkness still lurking beneath the surface. The year was 1972, and in the suburbs of Chicago, life seemed as ordinary as the steady rhythm of the seasons. Families filled the neighborhoods with backyard barbecues, high school football games, and parades on warm summer afternoons. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, shadows began to lengthen. Quietly at first, then with unsettling regularity, young men started vanishing. The earliest cases were almost dismissed as youthful wanderings. Teenage boys had always been restless after all. eager for adventure or escape. A few skipped school, others left home after arguments with their parents, and the police were often quick to assume they had simply run away. But for the families left behind, the silence stretched into dread. Their sons didn't come back. John Wayne Gacy, already establishing himself as a respected member of the community, moved comfortably among his neighbors. He was a contractor by trade, often hiring local teenagers for short-term jobs. He knew how to present himself as trustworthy, smiling at church gatherings, volunteering at events, and even dressing as Pogo the Clown for children's parties. Few could have imagined that behind the painted grin and affable handshake lurked a man capable of horrors. The pattern that would later become chillingly clear had already begun to take shape. Gacy would approach young men, sometimes at bus stations, other times on street corners, or even in local diners, and offer what seemed like simple opportunities. A night's work helping with a construction project, a chance to earn some quick cash, or an invitation to a party where there would be beer and laughter. For boys with few prospects, often from struggling households, the offers seemed harmless, even generous. They followed him willingly, unaware they were stepping into a trap from which none would return. The first confirmed killings began in this period. At the time, however, they were invisible to everyone but Gacy. Families reported their sons missing, posting flyers, calling neighbors, knocking on doors. Some mothers sat by their telephones night after night, waiting for calls that never came. Fathers searched the streets in anger and disbelief, trying to retrace the last steps their sons had taken. Yet again and again, the trail vanished into thin air. Community suspicions began to stir. A few noticed that many of the boys who disappeared had some connection to Gacy. Some had worked for him briefly. Others had been seen near his house on Somerdale Avenue. But suspicion was not evidence. Gacy's public face was too carefully maintained. He was friendly, cooperative with authorities, and quick to dismiss concerns. "Kids run off all the time," he would say with a shake of his head, echoing the police's own assumptions. For the parents, this dismissal was almost unbearable. Each missing boy was not just a statistic. He was a son, a brother, a friend. The local newspapers carried brief notes about the disappearances, but there was no larger narrative connecting them. No one yet realized that a predator was at work in their midst, building a hidden graveyard beneath his very home. As the early 1970s stretched on, the disappearances multiplied. Behind closed doors, some neighbors whispered, "Why did so many boys linked to Gacy seem to vanish? Why were there strange comings and goings at odd hours of the night?" But gossip is fragile without proof, and without proof, law enforcement hesitated. The idea that a popular, hard-working businessman could be involved in such crimes seemed too far-fetched. Yet the reality was already set in motion. Every time Gacy lured another boy with promises of work or pleasure, he tightened his hold on the secret life he led in the darkness. And with each disappearance, the community's unease deepened, even if they could not yet name its cause. What they did not know then, but would later come to understand in the most horrifying detail, was that the true nightmare had only just begun. The string of disappearances around Chicago had become impossible to ignore. Families grieved, police speculated, and the community whispered. But no one had answers. The neighborhood still waved politely at John Wayne Gacy, the cheerful contractor who handed out jobs to restless young men. He played the part of a model citizen so perfectly that no one could see the truth hiding in plain sight. What they didn't realize was that the missing boys hadn't vanished into thin air. They were closer than anyone imagined. So close, in fact, they were right beneath Gacy's feet. The house at 8213 Somerdale Avenue looked ordinary. Its pale siding and tidy yard gave no hint of the horrors within. But behind its doors, Gacy had built a private world of cruelty and death. Beneath the house stretched a cramped crawl space, no taller than 3 feet, where shadows clung to damp dirt walls. It was here that Gacy created his hidden graveyard. When he brought boys home, he often used charm and deception, offers of work, money, or parties. Once inside, his tone shifted. Gacy liked to play what he called tricks. The most infamous was the handcuff trick. He would demonstrate how easily he could slip free after locking the cuffs on himself, laughing as though it were nothing more than a party stunt. Then, he'd coax his guests to try. Once the cuffs clicked shut, the smile faded, and the reality became terrifyingly clear. Gacy was the only one with the key. From there, the ritual followed a pattern of abuse, mockery, and ultimate violence. He often strangled his victims with a rope and a piece of wood fashioned into a tourniquet. Some died quickly, others slowly, as Gacy tightened the rope with chilling calmness. And when the life had drained from their eyes, he dragged their bodies to the crawl space. At first, he dug shallow graves himself, sweating in the damp earth under his house. Later, as the number of victims grew, he forced some boys, still alive, to dig their own resting places. Layer upon layer, the ground beneath 8,213, Summerdale, filled with bodies. The stench of decay soon seeped through the floorboards, and visitors sometimes remarked on the foul odor. Gacy brushed it off with easy excuses. "It's the plumbing," he would say, or "just a little dampness in the crawl space." People believed him. After all, who would suspect the friendly neighbor in clown makeup was hiding a mass grave? By the late 1970s, the house had become a tomb. The crawl space was packed so tightly that Gacy eventually resorted to tossing some victims into the nearby Des Plaines River. Still, he kept smiling for his neighbors, still hosted barbecues, still played the clown. But the walls of 8213 Summerdale could only hold their secrets for so long. When investigators finally stepped inside, what they uncovered would shock the nation. The ordinary home, once just another suburban address, would forever be remembered as the House of Horrors, the stage where Gacy committed his most unspeakable acts. By 1978, his house had become a silent graveyard. Beneath its floors, the crawl space was packed with victims, young men who had entered Gacy's home with promises of work or adventure, never to emerge again. For years, Gacy hid behind his mask of normalcy. He was the friendly contractor, the clown who entertained children, the neighbor who waved from his yard. But in December of that year, one final disappearance would pull the mask away for good. On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peace finished his shift at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. He was bright, dependable, and eager to earn extra money. That evening, he told a coworker he was going to meet a contractor about a possible job, just for a few minutes. Then he'd be home in time for his mother's birthday celebration. He never came back. Robert's family immediately knew something was wrong. He wasn't the kind of boy to run away, and he certainly wouldn't miss his mother's birthday. His parents went to the police, and this time, unlike so many other missing boy cases, the authorities took it seriously. The contractor Robert had mentioned was quickly identified: John Wayne Gacy. When investigators first questioned Gacy, he was smooth and confident. He insisted he knew nothing about Robert and even joked with officers. But something about him didn't sit right. The detectives decided to dig deeper. Soon, the cracks in Gacy's facade began to show. A background check revealed a disturbing past. He had already served time in Iowa years earlier for sexually assaulting a teenage boy. That revelation, combined with Robert's sudden disappearance, gave police reason to act. They placed Gacy under round-the-clock surveillance. For days, detectives tailed him everywhere: restaurants, bars, gas stations. Gacy seemed to notice, but pretended not to care. He drank heavily, drove recklessly, and bragged to acquaintances that the police were after him. What he didn't realize was that the pressure was building, and with every passing day, he made more mistakes. The first slip came when officers searched his house for evidence. At a glance, the place seemed normal, cluttered but ordinary. Then they found items that didn't belong to Gacy at all: driver's licenses, jewelry, and clothing linked to missing boys. Each piece was another thread connecting him to the disappearances. Meanwhile, Gacy's behavior grew erratic. He boasted to friends that he was going down for murder and told others, "There are things you'll never understand about me." The once careful predator was unraveling. Surveillance officers noted how often he drank, how paranoid he became, and how he hinted at crimes without fully confessing. The turning point came when detectives matched evidence from Gacy's home to Robert Peast. With mounting pressure and an airtight case forming, the police obtained a second search warrant. This time, they focused on the crawl space. When the floorboards were lifted and investigators descended into the darkness, the truth was undeniable. The stench of death filled the air. Shallow graves stretched across the dirt floor. One body, then another, then another. Gacy's secret was out. Over the following days, authorities uncovered the remains of dozens of boys and young men. The disappearances that had haunted Chicago for years were finally explained, each one buried beneath the home of the man who had smiled at parades and painted children's faces as a clown. Robert Peast, the final victim, became the key to unlocking the horror. Without his disappearance, Gacy might have continued his facade for years longer. Instead, his mistakes, his arrogance, his carelessness, and his belief that he could outsmart the police led directly to his downfall. By the end of December 1978, the friendly neighbor was unmasked as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The legend of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, had been born. That evening, officers surrounded the modest home. To the neighbors, it may have looked like just another police operation, but for detectives, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Gacy, disheveled and exhausted from days of drinking and paranoia, was arrested on the spot. The friendly contractor, the man who had once played the clown at children's parties, was led away in handcuffs. Inside the house, investigators began their work. The second search of Gacy's home was nothing like the first. This time, they knew exactly what they were looking for. The stench that rose from the crawl space was undeniable. Officers pulled back floorboards and shined their flashlights into the darkness below. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One by one, the bodies emerged. Shallow graves covered the dirt, each one holding the remains of a young man who had vanished without a trace. Detectives described the crawl space as suffocating, heavy with the smell of death. Some bodies were skeletal, others preserved by the cold, but all told the same story: murder after murder, carefully hidden beneath the house of horrors. Meanwhile, Gacy sat in custody. At first, he tried to maintain his mask of arrogance and denial, but the weight of the evidence was too great. After hours of questioning, the dam finally broke. Gacy began to talk, and once he started, he could not stop. He confessed to killing dozens of boys and young men, luring them with promises of work, money, or parties. He described his infamous handcuff trick, the rope tourniquet, and the methods he used to subdue his victims. Some were buried in the crawl space, he admitted, while others were dumped in the Des Plaines River when there was no more room beneath his home. The detectives listened in stunned silence as the scale of his crimes unfolded. Gacy wasn't just admitting to murder, he was describing ritualized cruelty. He spoke with a chilling detachment, as though recounting routine tasks rather than the destruction of human lives. He couldn't recall every name, but he estimated the number at more than 30. The confession sent shockwaves across Chicago, and soon the entire nation. The smiling neighbor, the man who hosted block parties and volunteered as Pogo the Clown, had been hiding one of the largest series of murders in American history. Reporters swarmed the scene as the grisly details emerged. Families who had been waiting years for answers finally received them in the most devastating way possible. As bodies were pulled from the crawl space, each discovery felt like another hammer blow. Parents identified clothing, jewelry, and other personal items. The horror grew with each passing day until the tally reached 33 victims. The number was almost too large to comprehend. For the officers who had listened to Gacy's confession, the words would never leave them. He had smiled, even joked at times, as though he saw himself as untouchable. Yet the truth was undeniable. His reign of terror was over. The walls of his house could no longer contain his secrets, and the world would forever remember the name John Wayne Gacy. Not as a neighbor, not as a clown, but as one of the most monstrous killers of the 20th century. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Reporters swarmed the neighborhood, their cameras flashing as investigators carried stretchers from the house. The media dubbed it the House of Horrors, and within days the story dominated front pages across the nation. People were stunned. The man who had smiled in parades dressed as a clown, the man who had been trusted as a neighbor, had been living above a mass grave. As the excavation continued, the number of victims mounted. Officers worked tirelessly, often emerging from the crawl space with pale faces and shaking hands. Some broke down in tears. The final tally stunned even the most hardened detectives. 29 bodies pulled from beneath the house and its property, with 4 more discovered in the nearby Des Plaines River. The total count reached 33, but the horror didn't end with the body count. Identification became a monumental task. Many of the victims had been buried for years, their remains reduced to bone. Dental records, personal items, and scraps of clothing were often the only clues. Parents who had been searching for their missing sons for nearly a decade came forward, praying for answers, but dreading the confirmation. For some, the wait dragged on for months, even years, as forensic teams struggled to match names to remains. The nation watched in disbelief. The excavation of Gacy's crawl space was unlike anything the country had ever seen. A suburban home turned into a burial ground. A trusted man unmasked as a predator of unimaginable scale. The story wasn't just about murder, it was about betrayal, about evil hiding behind a painted smile and a neighborly wave. When the last body was carried from Gacy's home, the house itself became a symbol of horror. The crawl space was no longer just dirt and wood. It was a graveyard, a place where innocence had been stolen and lives extinguished. And for the families left behind, the excavation was both an ending and a beginning, the end of years of unanswered questions and the beginning of a lifetime of grief. By 1980, America had already come to know John Wayne Gacy as the killer clown. The excavation of his crawl space had revealed 33 victims, and the nation demanded justice. What followed was one of the most infamous courtroom battles in modern history, the trial that would come to be called the trial of the century. The prosecution's case was straightforward yet staggering. Gacy had lured, assaulted, and murdered dozens of young men over a span of years, concealing their bodies beneath his home and discarding others in the Des Plaines River. The evidence was overwhelming: photographs, personal items belonging to victims, and the chilling confessions Gacy himself had given to police. But the defense knew they could not deny the murders. Instead, they turned to a different strategy: insanity. Gacy's attorneys argued that no sane man could kill 33 people and live a normal public life. They painted him as a split personality, John the friendly neighbor and community clown, versus Gacy the predator consumed by darker urges. They tried to convince the jury that he was mentally ill, incapable of controlling his actions. If the jury believed them, Gacy could be spared the death penalty and confined to a psychiatric institution instead. The prosecution, however, dismantled this argument piece by piece. They called witnesses, survivors who had managed to escape Gacy's tricks and lived to tell the tale. These young men recounted how he used the infamous handcuff trick, how his voice shifted from playful to sinister, and how he threatened them with death before finally letting them go. Their testimonies revealed not a man consumed by madness, but one who was calculated, cruel, and fully aware of his actions. Investigators also took the stand, describing the excavation of the crawl space in harrowing detail. Jurors listened as officers recalled the suffocating air, the stench of decomposition, and the moment they realized just how many graves lay beneath the floor. Each testimony drove home the truth. Gacy had not acted in a frenzy of insanity. He had planned, executed, and concealed his crimes with methodical precision. The trial was a media spectacle. Courtrooms overflowed with journalists, sketch artists, and curious citizens who wanted to witness history unfold. Newspapers ran front-page stories daily, and television broadcasts delivered updates to millions of horrified Americans. For many, it was impossible to reconcile the image of Gacy in a clown suit, smiling at children, with the monster being described in court. Public reaction was visceral. Families of the victims sat in the gallery, their grief laid bare for the world to see. Some wept quietly as evidence was presented. Others glared at Gacy with hatred. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, carrying signs demanding the death penalty. The trial wasn't just about justice for the victims. It became a national reckoning, a symbol of how evil could hide behind the most ordinary of faces. In the end, the jury saw through the insanity defense. After weeks of testimony, They found John Wayne Gacy guilty on all counts of murder. The verdict was unanimous. He was sane, he was responsible, and he would face the ultimate punishment. The trial of the century had ended, but the legend of John Wayne Gacy and the horror of what he had done was only just beginning to echo across history. On March 13, 1980, after weeks of testimony, the jury in Cook County delivered its verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman announced what the world already suspected. John Wayne Gacy was guilty on all counts. 33 murders, the deadliest series of homicides by one man in American history. Moments later, the sentence was declared. For his crimes, Gacy would die by lethal injection. The decision was met with a wave of relief. Families of the victims wept openly, some embracing as the weight of years of fear and unanswered questions lifted. Outside the courthouse, crowds erupted in cheers. To many, justice had finally been served. Gacy, however, showed little emotion. He smirked, occasionally whispered to his lawyers, and seemed more irritated than remorseful. Yet the death sentence did not mean swift justice. Instead, Gacy was sent to Menard Correctional Center, where he would spend the next 14 years on death row. During that time, he launched appeal after appeal, claiming he had been unfairly tried, that his lawyers had failed him, even that the evidence had been exaggerated. But each appeal was rejected. Life on death row revealed another side of Gacy. While confined to his cell, he took up painting. His artwork was disturbing: images of clowns, self-portraits in costume, and strange abstract designs. Many saw it as an extension of his sinister personality, turning the clown persona into a grotesque reminder of his crimes. The paintings drew both fascination and outrage, with some collectors buying them as macabre trophies, while victims' families condemned them as a cruel insult to the dead. Gacy also granted interviews, often taunting the public with his lack of remorse. He blamed his victims, claiming they had put themselves in danger. At times, he denied responsibility altogether, saying he was innocent and the media had turned him into a monster. Other times, he coldly acknowledged the killings, but without guilt. "I'm the 34th victim," he once said, casting himself as the true casualty of the system. His arrogance only deepened the anger surrounding him. To the families who had lost their sons, his words were like salt in an open wound. They waited for the day when the state would carry out his sentence, when Gacy could no longer speak or mock the memory of the boys buried beneath his house. That day finally came on May 10, 1994. After exhausting his last appeals, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. Reporters filled the prison grounds, capturing the moment for a nation that had followed the case for more than a decade. Outside the gates, crowds gathered, some holding candles for the victims, others chanting for justice. Gacy's final words were as defiant as his life had been: "Kiss my ass." With that, the needle was inserted, and the reign of the killer clown ended. But even in death, his shadow remained. The crimes at 8213 Summerdale Avenue had left scars that would never fully heal. For the families, the conviction and execution closed one chapter, but the memory of lost sons and stolen lives would haunt them forever.